Hello, everyone. Let's take a look at our first reading, Epicurus's letter to Menoicus. Menoicus is how I pronounce it. I think it's closer to the Greek. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced as Menicius, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. It's his letter. Just as some background, and background is really not important in a philosophy course, I think. He was an ancient Greek philosopher. I think maybe the generation after Plato, but 4th century BC. Very, very important ancient philosopher. So important that his name has become a word, right? Epicurean or Epicureanism. And generally, that's the idea that the purpose of life is to enjoy yourself, to have pleasure. So oftentimes you'll hear people who are devoted to food or other pleasures, physical pleasures of life, as Epicurean. That's somewhat misleading, but not totally. But that's generally how we hear the word. I can tell you that Epicurus, in this context, in the context of a class on death, is so important that I will be using the term Epicurean and Epicureanism in a specific way, having to do with death. And it has nothing to do with pleasure. It has to do with Epicurus's ideas about what death is and how we should respond to his insight, or the insight into what death is. So nothing could be more important in this course than starting off with a firm understanding of Epicurus. It really is the touchstone of the course. I've been teaching the course a long time, and I've been teaching it this way a long time. And at this point, I couldn't think of starting with anything else but this letter. This is a very powerful, a deceptively simple, but incredibly powerful theory of what death is. The letter itself is a wide-ranging letter. One imagines that he's written it to a younger person as advice on how to live your life. And generally speaking, he touches on a lot of different points, but that's not our focus. This is a short reading, and the part that really interests us in a course on death is even shorter. I would like you to read the whole thing because I'd like you to be able to put his theory of death, his thoughts about death, into larger context. But the really important thing is to get to the third paragraph here. Nothing could be more important. I know I've said that before than this section of the letter for this course, because in a certain sense it sets up everything else. When it comes to actually philosophers actually saying what death is and giving us a theory of death, so to speak, about what happens to us when we die and how we should conceive of death itself. I would say everyone either is for or against Epicurus. Either they're assuming perhaps that Epicurus is right, or they are fighting against Epicurus, as we'll see later in the course when we read people like Plato and Paul Landsberg and C.S. Lewis. But let's look at this third paragraph. It's at the bottom of the first page. Accustom yourself to believe, let me make this bigger, that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. It's very dense. Accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us. So it's kind of ambiguous there. Is he saying that death is nothing to us? Or is he saying that it would be better for us to believe that? I think it's an important distinction. It's not clear yet. Like, sometimes things are true and people are trying to point out why they're true. And sometimes people are trying to convince us that not so much that something is true, but that we'll be better off if we believe that it's true. And it's not clear which one Epicurus is advocating there. I think we'll see by the end of this section which one he means, but it's not clear from the beginning. So accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil, that is, regarding something as good or evil, as something which is has that character of either being good or evil, that implies awareness. That is, if I say that something is good for me, at the very least, I must be aware of it. And if I say something is an evil for me, well, that implies that I'm aware of it again. And death is the privation. Remember, privation is the taking away, the depriving of. And death is the privation of all awareness. Right? So here we're something like a paradox, really. I mean, is death good? Is death evil? Well, for it to be good or evil for me, I have to be aware of it. My death we're talking about here. But death is the taking away of all awareness. So am I ever even aware of death? So could it be good? You see the line of reasoning. Therefore, right understanding that death is nothing to us. Okay, now here I think we get a little clearer. Death is nothing to us, right? It's not just that it would be better for us to think that it's nothing. Death is nothing to us because, well, we're not aware of it. As we'll see, it's just not part of our experience. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable. Not the morality of life, the mortality of life, the fact that we are mortal. Being a mortal creature is being the kind of creature that can and will die. And he's saying that if we understand death rightly, that makes mortality enjoyable. Now, I'm not quite sure I would go that far, but that he's actually proved that it's enjoyable. But look at the next thing that he says. Not by adding to life an unlimited time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. Now, the yearning after immortality would be the desire to live forever. But the desire to live forever is prompted by the desire to avoid death, obviously. But if death is nothing to us, then there's no reason to yearn for immortality because there's nothing bad about death. There's nothing good about it either, but there's certainly nothing bad about it. That is, if we have the right insight into what death is, then there's no reason to want to live forever because there's no reason not to die. I mean, there's no reason to avoid death if it is not something that is an evil. For life has no terror, he continues, for those who thoroughly apprehend that there are no terrors for them in ceasing to live. Now, that's good. Again, ceasing to live brings with it no evil. It brings with it no unpleasantness. It brings with it no pain. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, because remember, for something to be good for us, we have to be aware of it. And if death is the taking away of all awareness, then at least when it comes to our own death, we're not aware of it. It's not something that actually, you might say, actually happens to us. It's just the limit of our experience. And when it's reached, we no longer exist. Foolish, therefore, he says, is the person who says that he fears death, not because it will pain when it comes, but because it pains in the prospect. Now, that's a little bit, I always thought that particular sentence was very difficult to put together, but I think it's clearly he's suggesting that if you're worried about death, you're wasting your time because you're worrying about something that is inherently nothing, so that it can't hurt you. If you're worried about your dentist appointment tomorrow because you're worried about perhaps the pain and discomfort that you will experience, that's a rational fear because sometimes it hurts. But if you're worried about death, that's an irrational fear because there's no pain associated with death. It's just ceasing to be. So if you're wasting your time thinking, well, if you're thinking a lot about death, you're worried about death, you're thinking how terrible death is, you're wasting your time because it's not anything that is ever going to hurt you, let's say, because when it comes, you no longer exist. And that's what he says next. Whatever causes no annoyance when it is present causes only a groundless pain in the expectation, right? Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, and that I think has to be read ironically. He doesn't really think that death is an evil because that would contradict what he says in the beginning. Death is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come. And when death is come, we are not. That's perhaps the best expression, I think, of his theory of death. When we are, when we are here, when we live, that logically requires that death has not come. That is, you and I are, right? You and I exist. And that logically implies that death has not come because we exist. And when death has come, we are not. That is, if death has come, that logically implies that we are not, that we no longer exist. That's pretty powerful, right? Because that sets up the conclusion it is nothing then either to the living or the dead. For with the living, it is not, and the dead exist no longer. So there's no time when we actually experience death. I mean, sense of our own death. So that doesn't exist. If when death comes, that means we have ceased to be anything. So we don't experience anything good or bad. We become nothing. So what I suppose the conclusion is that if you're worried about it, you're just wasting your time needlessly because it's nothing that can hurt you. Because again, you no longer exist. But in the world, at one time, people shunned death as the greatest of all evils, and at another time choose it as a respite from the evils in life. The wise person does not deprecate life, nor does he fear the cessation of life. The thought of life is no offense to him, nor is the cessation of life regarded as an evil. And even as people choose of food, not merely and simply the larger portion, but the more pleasant, so the wise seek to enjoy the time which is most pleasant, and not merely that which is longest. It trails off into, or it sort of slowly gets into other subjects there, so that really it's just the section here, the very beginning, not the very beginning, the first part of the paragraph, and then really to here, I would say, is about all there is, and it's quite enough because he's given us a certain theory of death, and moreover, not just a theory of what death is, but a philosophy of what we should conclude, what we should infer from our knowledge or insight into what death is. And first of all, death is nothing to us, not because it's better to think that, because it's truly nothing to us, because it's not something we'll ever experience. Again, when we are, death has not come. And when death has come, we are not. What that, I think, expresses is that death is not a part of life. Now, dying, the act of dying, the act of approaching death, that is certainly something that we could experience. But dying and death are two different things. Right? Dying is an experience of life. It's that part of life which we regard as being the prelude to death, but it is part of life, whereas death is not part of life. If we go by Epicurus' notion of what death is the limit of life. And when we reach that limit, we no longer exist. So if death is the privation, the taking away of all awareness, we're never actually aware of our own death. It's not an experience that we go through. It's reaching a limit. And when we reach that limit, we no longer are. So the idea that death is nothing to us is an incredibly powerful idea because it's the idea that at death we become nothing. So I will be referring to Epicureanism as we move through the course, and I suppose what I'll be meaning by that is some simple propositions that we can get out of this passage from Epicurus' letter. First of all, to be an Epicurean when it comes to death is to believe that at death we become nothing. So nothing like an afterlife. If death is defined as the privation of all awareness, and it is, right? I mean, he defines death right here. Death is the privation, the taking away, the deprivation of all awareness. Then there's no continued consciousness after death. That would be a contradiction. Death is the final, complete, irrevocable end of the person. That's what it means to be an Epicurean. What it also means to be an Epicurean is to regard death as nothing, therefore, as neither good nor bad, as either good nor evil, as something which really doesn't concern me because it's nothing that I'll ever go through. Once it comes, I am not. And while I am, that means it has not come. There's never a point at which I and death meet, you know. So it's not something that I should concern myself with. So to be an Epicurean with regard to death is to have a certain theory of death. That is, that at death we become nothing and there's no experience of death. And also to have a certain response to that. Well, as a result, I shouldn't really concern myself with death because it's not something that, again, is either good or evil, because it's not something I'll ever be aware of, but certainly not something evil. Now, what we'll see in the next two readings from Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher are attempts to generally accept the first principle or the first proposition that at death we become nothing, without accepting the second one, the inference that death therefore is not an evil. What they're trying to do is to keep the broader idea that at death we become nothing and there's no afterlife, without committing themselves to Epicurus's idea that therefore death is not an evil to us. But we'll see that when we take a look at those readings in weeks 2 and 3.